World War II shaped the lives of a generation. The war broke families apart, brought communities together, and turned a depressed economy into an industrial machine. On the home front, citizens sold war bonds and collected scrap metal for the factories. Friends were made and lost as a generation of boys was sent into combat. Penn State Public Broadcasting invited those who lived this history to share their stories of World War II.
My name is Robert Lima, L-I-M-A. I was born in Havana, Cuba, 1935. And I lived there until 1944. From there, I went to Puerto Rico for a brief stay with some relatives, while my dad got himself settled in the States. And then in 1945, while the war was still on, I came to New York and have been in the States ever since. Cuba was an ally of the United States, and as a consequence, was very much concerned about the nearness of the U-boats, German submarines, many of which have been seen around the Florida coast. And so there was this kind of sense of being ill at ease with the possibility of the Germans coming ashore. My father was very much involved in the media in those days, and so he would, tell us, and certainly tell my mother, and of course I would be there. I was about 5.5 years old, so I would pick up on this and be very much aware, at least, of that terrifying possibility that the Germans were coming, I was waiting for my dad to return home from work. It was an evening moment, and I was on a balcony overlooking the Paseo del Prado, which is the main thoroughfare in Havana. And I was anxiously waiting for him, and suddenly a lot of people gathered on the Prado, this promenade, on both sides of the street, right under our balcony. And I was concerned about what was going on. I saw a lot of floodlights all of a sudden lighting the sky, and being aware of the possibility of a German invasion, that was probably the very first thing that came to my mind, because these lights were searching the skies. Then suddenly, everybody's attention turned to my right, as it was, and I saw this parade of cars. In one of them, an open-top car, was standing a Nazi-clad figure, and it was Adolf Hitler, holding his arm up like this in the typical Nazi salute, and passing right under my my balcony. Well, you can imagine how I felt, having feared all this time that this would happen. So I was terrified that the Germans had finally come to Havana, and that in fact they had conquered if he was there parading in front of me. I was so excited when my father got home and told him about my problems with this situation, and he then revealed to me that it was a film that was being premiered a couple of blocks down the street, and that this was an actor portraying Adolf Hitler. So I was a little deflated, yes, because, it's so exciting to have all of these experiences happen in front of you. But on the other hand, I was very, very happy that it was all fiction. My father, that Sunday, December the 7th, 1941, was in his radio studio in Havana. He owned a radio station. It was much too early in the morning to be broadcasting, so he was there, and he was tuning in shortwave receptions, which was one of his hobbies. And then suddenly he picked up this broadcast, which sounded very realistic to him, and he kept on listening to it, and he learned that it was being broadcast from Pearl Harbor, from one of the military areas there, and it was during the actual attack of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. So my father immediately recognized the importance of this and called the White House. At that early moment in the morning, I forget what the time was, it was amazing that he got through. Got through to some operator who put him on to someone else. My father then put on the broadcast, hooked it up to the telephone, and let them hear what was going on. Unfortunately, they didn't believe it. Why? Probably because of Orson Welles' broadcasts earlier on about the invasion by the Mars people, or whatever they were, by the Martians. So they thanked him very much, and that was it. So my father was undoubtedly one of the very first people to hear what was going on as it was happening. And the unfortunate part, as I said, is that he was not able to convince these people in Washington that this was a real event. Eventually, of course, they got the news more directly themselves and then accepted it. I don't know that again, just like in the Hitler thing, I don't know whether I was really that aware of what the Japanese were up to. I knew that that event had taken place and that it was a very important and major event. And eventually, of course, I realized it brought the United States into the war. But as I said, I was 5.5, going on 6, and I don't think that I was really that aware of the implications of that moment. And in Puerto Rico, for some reason, my mother, my brother, and I, living as we did in a town called Mayagüez, which is about the third largest city on the island, we were kind of separated from all the kinds of events that I'd experienced in Cuba. I didn't have much of a sense of the war there, maybe because Puerto Rico is a small island. It didn't feel as threatened, I don't know. But whatever the reason, I was not really aware of what was going on in 1944 when I moved from Cuba to Puerto Rico. We lived there for about 8 months. And then in the early 1945, my father sent for us. He had come to New York to get himself settled in business. And so we flew. Incredible, because flights in those days were very difficult. When we flew from Havana, we flew on a Pan Am seaplane to Puerto Rico, and similarly to Florida. So we landed in Miami and spent a night or two there, and then took a train, because on the mainland, flights were not really very much available to civilians. So we took a train all the way to Newark, and arrived in New York in a couple of days. And my father picked us up, took us into Manhattan, and my biggest wonderful memory of that evening was going around the Great Bend towards the Lincoln Tunnel and seeing Manhattan at night all lit up. It was an amazing. It was what O. Henry called Baghdad on the Hudson. It was a magnificent sight, which I've never forgotten. And so then we settled into Manhattan, and my mother would take my brother, who was 3 years younger, and myself, I was 10 at the time, to the store with her, with the coupon books for getting the food and milk and things like that. The reason she took us was twofold. First of all, we had no babysitter. And secondly, she was a very devious, wonderful woman who used us to try to get the butcher and the provider of milk and all these other people to take pity on her, because she had these 2 little kids to feed, and the coupon books weren't enough, and usually it worked. So we would go from store to store, or sometimes even to the A&P supermarket or Safeway supermarket, and my mother would usually win out in this coupon business, you know. We were always pretty well fed, but I'm not sure that my parents ate as well as we did, you know. It was that idea of self-sacrifice for your children, and I think that was probably typical of most households with children in those days. So rationing was a necessity, but there were people out there willing to stretch things a little bit and make it possible for families with small children to get sugar and milk and eggs and things like that. So it was a difficult time, but we all managed. Other people suffered a lot more. I don't consider that we suffered. I think we did very well. This was one of the wonderful things about the Second World War, not only in New York, but as I said, in Cuba. People were with the idea of the war. They knew it was a just war, and a war that we had to win. Otherwise, and I'm saying we because I felt an integral part of it, that had to be won, because if it wasn't, then what were the consequences? there was a great deal of solidarity, yes. New York and everywhere that I remember. Well, we had to do blackouts and things like that. In Cuba, we had to do blackouts. In Puerto Rico, I don't recall. Frankly, we lived on a mountaintop and in a private home away from the city, so I don't recall. But in New York, yes, you had to do blackouts, which meant that there was some concern that there might be an attack. Although the German aircraft could not reach us, the submarines certainly could. And in fact, many were seen off the coast, the Atlantic coast in the east. So yeah, I think that there was anxiety, although I don't think it was a major motivating factor. Nonetheless, it was there. Eventually, VE Day came around. We were living in a 4th-floor walk-up, and everybody was yelling and screaming, so we went downstairs out into the street, and people were throwing confetti and ranting and raving. It was VE Day, Victory in Europe. I'm standing there, and by then I had a better sense of things, and so I was clapping and yelling too. And all of a sudden, a Manhattan telephone directory came from high up above and landed smack right next to me. Now, New York telephone directories in those days, even in 1945, were pretty thick. And so this created a big thump. And I said to myself, well, I jumped back, and then I've come to realize that I could have been one of the very last victims of the war at that very moment. So that's why that particular event stayed with me for so long. It was an amazing experience. It was happiness, and people were so jovial and glad that things were over in Europe that this guy, whoever it was, threw this telephone directory. Confetti, I can understand. A telephone directory, I don't know.